with me. As the country reels from a second mass shooting in 1 week, politicians on the Hill once again turn their attention to more gun control legislation, which has fallen to partisan divide for decades. But our next guest says America's gun and mass shooting problem goes far beyond what any bill can accomplish, that this is a deep-rooted cultural problem that must be examined on a personal level. So joining us to discuss this, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of, and host, of course, of On Contact, Chris Hedges. His latest post that I was referring to, called "The Evil Within Us," can be seen at sheerpost.com. That's SCHEER, sheerpost.com. Chris, first, that was a great write-up. I really enjoyed reading this post. You dug into a lot of philosophical perspectives here as you examined last week's mass shooting in Atlanta, which killed 8 people, 6 of those being Asian women. Can you summarize your story for the viewers?
Well, I was looking at the ideology of the Christian right, which clearly influenced Long, who carried out the killings in Atlanta. I wrote a book, American Fascists, the Christian Right in the War in America. Spent 2 years in these mega churches, Right to Life weekends, etc. And there is a binary kind of view of the world, an idea that that world outside the magic circle of the megachurch and the home is one controlled by Satan and secular humanists who put temptation before people to lure them towards self-disintegration and sin, whether that's gambling, pornography, massage brothels, etc. And so alcoholism and drugs, of course, everything else. So I was trying to explain how that externalization of evil, that belief that evil is embodied in the other, who if we eradicate, we can somehow purge the world of evil. We can purge the world of impurity. And that, of course, also ties in to American imperialism, that somehow if we can go abroad and kill the appropriate Muslims, we will make the world a better and safer place. And it's that the philosophical inability to see the evil within us that does so much damage. So that was there. It's always been within the DNA of American culture, and it's just sacralized by the Christian right.
Would you agree that America has a deep-rooted culture of guns? I mean, to this country's core of its founding, guns, or muskets at the time, were written into the Constitution. And in today's modern age of automatic rifles, is this something Congress can simply legislate out of America's collective conscience?
No, but you can impose legislation to block the proliferation of guns. The United States is 4.4% of the global population. We own 42% of the world's guns. So that's certainly a first step. But you're right. Richard Slotkin wrote a very fine trilogy, The Historian, Gunfighter Nation. This whole idea of purification through violence is something that is within the DNA of the United States. So it's both, there's both the necessity of restricting access, especially to automatic weapons. I grew up in Maine. My family were all hunters. You can't use these AR-15 weapons for hunting. The caliber of the bullet is too small for big game like deer and stuff like that. So these are really weapons designed solely for the purpose of shooting other human beings. And the fact that they're so easily accessible, of course, we saw the shootings in Oklahoma. We don't know what the motive of this mass killer was, but we, the United States, I think from about 1988 to 2012, we account for 31% of the mass shootings worldwide. So it's a multifaceted problem, and you're right, part of it is the ideology itself, but it is also the fact that guns are easily accessible. The shooters in Atlanta and the shooter in Oklahoma, I think both bought their automatic weapons a week before they went on their shooting sprees.
Oh, I think you're referring to Boulder, yesterday's shooting.
Boulder, yeah, sorry.
Your write-up obviously was just published a day before the Boulder mass shooting. There are many on the right who are now trying to shift the conversation away from the root of hate or the ties to white supremacy because all 10 of the Boulder victims were white. So does yesterday's tragedy support your thesis? Because I know many people watching might try to argue that it disproves the narrative.
Well, mass shootings in the United States occur for a variety of reasons. The hatreds that are expressed through this kind of violence are different hatreds. And so it may very well be that the motives of the shooter in Boulder don't correlate at all with the motives of the shooter in Atlanta. That's the issue is that we have an epidemic of mass shootings that dwarfs what takes place in just about anywhere else in the world except for Yemen, which has a higher rate of mass shootings. But Yemen, of course, is a country at war.
Now, the U.S., and I think you touched on this just a moment ago, the U.S. is the only Western and developed nation with such problems. Why do you suppose that is?
Well, because we have very lax gun control, and because the citizenry has access to assault-style weapons, which are combat-grade weapons with very little background check. And so, for instance, in China, you did have a series of mass attacks, I believe, in schools a few years ago, but the perpetrators used knives because they couldn't get guns. And they were still lethal, but not to the extent of the mass shootings in the United States.
And, you know, Chris, if we can talk more broadly about the media coverage, since we have some extra time, I would like for you to explore. I mean, you've been a reporter, you've been a bureau chief in Asia, in the Middle East, rather. Can you explore the differences in American media, how these tragedies are covered here versus how when tragedies like that happen, like you mentioned in China, are things different, and do the public respond differently?
Yes. Well, first of all, because they're so rare. So you had a mass shooting in Britain, you had a mass shooting, I believe it was in 1996 or something, in Australia, and there was immediate gun control, gun restrictions, registration. And because the event was so rare, the media response was different. Here, it's virtually normalized. I mean, here we've had 1 week with 2 mass shootings. The whole idea of gunmen going into schools and shooting up students from Columbine to elementary school in Parkland, exactly. There's a kind of normalization to it, and then of course we have a very strong, embodied mostly in the Republican Party, gun lobby that repeats this mantra that guns don't kill, people kill, and if we take away guns, then only criminals will have guns. This is a kind of absurdist argument that doesn't really carry any weight in the rest of the developed world.
Yeah, and I hate to say this, but last year was, 2020 being the first year of COVID, I think as a reporter, the first time I remember in a long time that as far back as I can remember that we hadn't had a mass shooting. Do you buy some of the arguments saying that people, for example, in Atlanta, some of the police sort of whitewashing what happened and saying, that Robert Aaron Long was at the end of his rope, COVID and all that?
Well, you're talking about this deputy sheriff who made this statement. Yeah, this was kind of a ridiculous statement, but I think it's kind of gets to the issue of racism, of blaming the victims for their own deaths. And that gets to the whole marginalization of people of color, the kind of stereotypes, dehumanization, objectification of Asians, and in particular Asian women. There was, I think, 4,000 reports that since they've been collecting recently, reports on hate crimes and hate-related incidents. 70% of those have been directed at Asian or Asian American women.
Yeah, absolutely. That number is just astounding. Thank you so much for joining us on this extended talk. I mean, 2 tragedies in 1 week, Chris. Great to have you on. Chris Hedges, always appreciate your take. Thank you.
Thanks, Manila.